this is problem 12-2 parts D through G from chapter 12 of your textbook. And we're given two graphs here. We're given one that has real GDP on the x-axis and planned real consumption and investment, or C&I, on the y-axis, and we're given another that has real GDP per year on the x-axis and planned savings and investment on the y-axis. And we're asked to use these graphs to find the equilibrium level of GDP. Now, remember, the equilibrium level of GDP is wherever GDP equals consumption plus investment. Now, how do we find that on a graph? Let me magnify our graph here so we can look at it better. So I'm going to use the consumption and investment graph, since we know that this equilibrium is determined by GDP and consumption and investment. So I'm going to use this graph. And remember from algebra that this line, the skinny black line here, is at the 45 degrees, which in algebra is the line that if you were to graph y equals x, right? So this is the y equals x line, which for our graph is where planned real C&I equals real GDP. So we know that our equilibrium is going to be somewhere on that line, because that's the definition of our equilibrium, is where C plus I equals GDP. So it's got to be on this y equals x line, right? But we also know, because they've graphed it here with this top, I guess it's purple line, that C plus I, where it's labeled up here, so this top line is our C plus I line. C plus I always lives on this line. We want it to be on the light black line. So we'll just go up our C plus I line to where it intersects with our y equals x line, and that's where our equilibrium will be. It's wherever C plus I equals GDP. So it's at point F, our GDP equilibrium. Point F is at a GDP level of 8,000. We can find that from our x-axis, where our GDP is for point F. It's 8, and this is in thousands. So 8,000 is what I'll go back and put in as my equilibrium GDP, which is where GDP equals consumption plus investment, C plus I. The next question. In this economy, the numerical value of the multiplier is. Now, the multiplier, what is this guy? The multiplier is discussed on page 280 and following in your textbook. And the multiplier is defined as the ratio of the change in the equilibrium level of real GDP to the change in autonomous real expenditures. The multiplier can also be thought of as the number by which you multiply a change in investment or consumption to get the change in equilibrium real GDP. We're also given in the textbook a formula for finding this multiplier, and we're told that it is, let me write it down here. We're told that this formula is, so the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so remember, the marginal propensity to consume is change in consumption divided by the change in GDP. So we can go back to our graphs and we can find this value for marginal propensity to consume by looking at the slope of the line of our graph. So let's pull this up. So let's look at the consumption line. So we can find the ratio of change in consumption over change in GDP. And this is really just going to be the slope of this line, because remember, the slope formula is change in y over change in x. And for us, y is C and x is GDP. So we just want to find the slope of this line. And we can do that by choosing 2 points. And I'll choose these two that are obvious. So where GDP is 0, consumption is 0.5. And where GDP is 2, consumption is 2. So those are 2 points on this line we can use to find the slope. If you need to go back and brush up on your algebra, you can Google slope formula, things like that, to help you remember how to calculate this slope, but really what we're interested in is the change in consumption divided by change in GDP. So how does consumption change between these 2 points? Consumption goes from 0.5 to 2. So it goes from, so the change is 2 minus 0.5, which is a change of 1.5. And how does GDP change? GDP changes from 0 at this point to 2 at this point that's labeled E. So GDP changes by a value of 2. So our marginal propensity to consume then is the change in consumption, which is 1.5, divided by the change in GDP, which is 2. So we'll come over here. Our MPC equals 1.5 divided by 2, which we can ask our calculator to do this math for us. 1.5 divided by 2, and we get 0.75 as our marginal propensity to consume. 0.75. So now we just take that, we take this and plug it in to the formula for the multiplier. So the multiplier is going to be 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75, or 1 divided by 0.25. And again, we can ask our calculator for that answer if we want. 1 divided by 0.25, and we get that the multiplier is 4. So we can go back and plug that in to our question. Good. Had there not been any investment, the economy's equilibrium GDP would be. So if there is no investment, our C plus I just becomes C, right? So the equilibrium for the economy is always wherever C plus I equals GDP, or where the C plus I line crosses the 45-degree line, the Y equals X line. And so if there is no I, then that just becomes where the C line, the consumption line, crosses the 45-degree line, and that's at point E in this graph. So the equilibrium GDP for point is shown at point E, and that GDP is 2000. So what is the multiplier effect from the inclusion of investment? That effect is just what the equilibrium GDP would have been without investment, and how that's different from what the GDP equilibrium level is with investment. So that's a difference of $6,000. So the multiplier effect from including investment is just how that changes, how including investment changes the GDP, which is 6,000. Because we went from 8,000 down to 2,000 when we didn't include the investment in GDP. Lastly, if autonomous investment declines from 1,500 to 1,000, what does the equilibrium real GDP change to? Now, this is where we get to use the multiplier that we found. Remember, the multiplier is the number by which a change in the investment or consumption is multiplied to get the change in real GDP. So we take our change in investment, multiply it by the multiplier, and then we have our change in GDP. So I know that investment changed from 1,500 to 1,000. So the change in investment, I'll pull up my calculator here to do this, is my 1,000 minus 1,500. That's my change in investment. Now I take that, multiply it by the multiplier, because the multiplier, that's the whole point, the definition of the multiplier is the number that we multiply our change in investment or consumption by to get our change in GDP. So I find my change in investment, which is negative 500, multiply it by the multiplier, which is 4, and now I know what my change in GDP will be. My change in GDP is a negative 2,000, which means GDP will go down 2,000 from where it was with our original level of investment, which was 8,000. So our new GDP is 8,000 minus 2,000, which is 6,000. And we're done with this question. I know there's a lot in that. There's a lot of math and a lot of definitions. You got to know what the multiplier is. You got to know where the equilibrium is. All these things. So if you need to read more about it, please check out the section in your textbook starting on page 280 where it starts talking about this multiplier. If you still have more questions, shoot me an email, stop by office hours, we'll talk through it. Thanks.